I wanted to ask you, and I don't want to, but I remember always being disappointed that you didn't cover the Superman. And can you just tell us the story about that, just because?
Sure. Well, actually, I was watching the film clip up there, and I was thinking, I think we probably covered everything in that list except that one. The reason we didn't cover that one is because the producers wanted you to believe a man could fly. They just shut us down. They were not interested in any kind of publicity on how the effects were done, and it was the sulk and and we still get that, believe it or not. We still get that. We don't want to spoil the magic, and so we still fight that on a somewhat daily basis.
We want you to believe that dragon is real.
Yeah.
Because if you read Cinefex, you might know it's not real.
Yeah. So yeah, it's an ongoing battle, and we get new regimes of the different. We can always tell when there's a new studio executive because suddenly things get
the new weird. The new ones you got to cover clearly.
We got that one, yeah.
Well, it's interesting because I do sometimes sympathize with that idea, but on the other hand, I think the market that you participate in is very specific. It's really toward film professionals, people interested in visual effects and production. It's not quite a mass-marketed item, but it's very targeted to industry professionals, and that's why it should be clearly supported and allowed.
I agree.
That's my feeling.
I agree.
Yeah, I mean it's unofficial, but it is like a trade magazine in a way. So I mean it'd be like Plumber's magazine not wanting to reveal, the new sprocket or whatever. You can tell I don't know plumbing, but I mean, it's like it's an insider's magazine.
I think wires were involved. I'm not sure because I didn't read it in your magazine, but I think they did use wires.
I miss the days when wires were involved, actually. It's much harder to write about digital stuff, right, Joe, than it is. This example I always use, Poltergeist, they need the house to implode at the end, so Richard Edlund goes out and shoots it with an elephant gun, right? That's great. That's easy to write about that. But it's very different when you have to write about, what people did digitally. There's still a lot of, it takes a lot of talent and ingenuity even, and it's just a harder thing to write about because, as someone in the state of the art thing said, people used to always want to come to my shop because there were models and there were things up on rigs and it was really exciting. And now when people say they want to come tour my shop, I say, fine, but it looks like a typing pool. Because really that's what it is. You got a bunch of people sitting there at monitors a lot. So it's a harder thing to write about.
Yeah, I was actually on the stage when we were photographing this at ILM.
This is Poltergeist.
This is Poltergeist. This is the collapsing house sequence. And there were a whole bunch of wires and little threads and fishing. The attempt was to implode it and make it sort of go into a ball and go away into sort of this strange, imploding explosion. And it started to not work, and that's when Richard brought out a shotgun.
Yeah, Richard has a collection of about 1,000 shotguns.
And actually, it is a true story. And when he brought the shotgun out, I left because I said that's time. It's time when people start shooting things with shotguns. I think you want to,
But it's a cool thing to write about.
It's definitely much more dramatic than sitting at the workstation and pointing at something. We always would sort of, as we're doing things, after a while, of course, we could, having run my own company that did visual effects, we would often kind of go, okay, I bet if we do this picture, Don's going to like it, and he's going to use it. And we started to do that. And I remember in particular, we were working on Bram Stoker's Dracula, and we really said, okay, we're doing miniatures, we're doing backings, big sets. This is gonna be great stuff. We bought a 4x5 camera, and we just put a lot of effort into getting these great shots, and we sent them to you, and you just absolutely went crazy for it. And we were like, yes.
That was smart.
Yeah. Well, there's a gentleman sitting in the front row here, Virgil Morano, who was responsible for probably the best of the behind-the-scenes imagery we've featured in the first 10 years of the magazine. He worked worked Blade Runner, Star Trek. I mean, and large format, beautiful things, beautifully lit, staged photographs, and they were just a joy to have. So, my hat's off to you.
Those were the days.
Those were the days.
You got the originals too.
That's right. We actually were given the originals to scan. So, or we didn't even scan them then. We did color separations.
Well, I think we all share that, you know, for those of us that have a traditional visual effects background, that's how we came to this industry. We were trained, you know, usually more as cameramen or artists or more crafts type of people. And then when, you know, digital came in and sort of redefined everything, we missed some of those techniques, you know, and every once in a while we have an opportunity to sort of revisit them with miniatures and things like that. And it's also exciting when you get to do that because we do love that aspect of it, which is sort of what drew us toward it in the first place. And now, of course, you know, with simulating environments on the computer is really gotten to a point where it's looking very photoreal. And so you have to acknowledge that you know, technology changes and redefines you, and you have covered that, absolutely covered that, and made a record of that in a way that wouldn't have been made if it weren't for your efforts. Mm-hmm. So even though it's not as much fun to talk about, there's still a lot of great work, you know, being done today, and you guys are definitely still on it.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the fact, you know, we have a Facebook page with 12,000 Facebook fans, I guess, and most of whom I don't think have liked a special effects movie that's been made after about 1990. At least the most vocal of them, they're always like, oh God, you know, they're making another Star Trek movie. Please, we don't want digital effects. You know, they profess to hate digital effects. Well, the fact is, you know, the effects now are better than they ever were. They're just not as interesting to write about or as to read about, but they're awesome work that's being done now. And if you go back and you look at comparable things that were done in generations past, you may have an emotional fondness for how things were done in the old days. But as much as I love Willis O'Brien, I don't think you know, the effects in his movies would stand up to today's audiences. You know, so you kind of apply a different standard of excellence. You know, whether it's Willis O'Brien or Ray Harryhausen. That's people of my generation, that's what we grew up with. It was Willis O'Brien and Ray Harryhausen. Those are probably the only two special effects people anybody had ever heard of. And I still love those movies, but, you know, technology has moved on.
You kind of alluded to it too, Greg, is the transition between that was a very interesting time, you know, obviously for the industry, because I remember you showing me your graveyard of Silicon graphics machines, I think.
Oh, yes, yeah. It's at a point where it's not even worth plugging them in anymore.
Right.
And they each were $25,000, you know.
Yeah. But it changed that fast. I mean, it changed so fast, faster than anyone saw coming, really. And it was us trying to keep up with it. It was really a weird time. I always like to give credit to someone named Mark DePay. I don't know if any of you know. But Mark was one of the first graduates from UC Berkeley's computer science doctorate program, and so one of these unbelievably brilliant guys. But he had the ability to explain digital and CGI to us in a way that at least I could understand it, which was no small feat. And he just kind of opened that world for me. It made me realize, okay, I don't have to be a computer genius to write about this. There's certain fundamentals I have to know, and he explained it to me. And I've always been so grateful to him. A lot of the other people that came out of those computer science programs in the early days especially, you couldn't talk to them. I mean, this was like talking to a completely different species. It's not so bad now. Most of them, everybody's kind of gotten cool with the lingo, you know, but...
Well, it's probably hard talking to the traditional visual effects guys, too, because I'm sure they had some lingo that was hard to catch on, too, right?
What, you mean technical?
Yeah. I mean, you know...
Well, even I understand using a shotgun to blow up a model, you know?
Okay.
I'm no genius, but even I get that. But yeah, sure. I mean, sometimes, like, I love the special effects guys, especially the older ones, the guys that do the physical effects. For one thing, they call me honey, which I love. I just don't have that offended feminist thing in me. I just think it's cute as can be. And they draw me pictures.
So you can understand.
In a way, they talk down to me a little bit, but in that case, it's good. I'm glad. It's like, okay. And really, I've had some of the older, I won't say his name, but
I think we know who it is.
I know you do. And he'll draw me little pictures, and it helps a lot. Some of those rigs are pretty complicated. So this is
but there's an entirely different kind of interview you did with the special effects guys than with the visual effects guys, because these guys are pretty taciturn, a lot of them.
Oh gosh, yeah.
Yeah. So I remember, I guess it was on T2, hanging around on the set night after night after night to get to talk to Tommy Fisher, who was the special effects supervisor on that show. Did a lot of Cameron's movies over the years. And I think when and he was always, running around and putting me off because he didn't really want to talk to me. And I think when I finally nailed him down, I said, okay, well, let's talk about the scene where you blew up the hospital or something, And he said, so how did you do that? And he said, well, we just blew it up, that was his answer to just about every question was, we just blew it up, So
yeah.
And so it was a little hard. So actually, he was still working with Cameron on Titanic, and I was down in Mexico when they were shooting down there. Unfortunately, Tommy's son was now in the business. I can't remember what his son's name is.
Scott,
yeah. And Scott happily sat in on the interview I had with Tommy on that movie, and I got all the information. Scott was very, very vocal and very helpful.
Yeah.
But there was just kind of, it's just the old school kind of, get in there and do it and don't make a fuss about it. And that's just, we did that.
Don't brag about it.
Yeah, it's no big deal. We just did it,
yeah.
And yet they'd be coming up with these amazing rigs and things that, take an engineering degree to figure out, but they just didn't think anything they were doing was special enough to talk about.
Yeah, kind of like us.
No, not at all. Titanic was sort of an interesting transitional movie where they still were photographing miniatures, but they were sort of using digital technology. Was that? Were you aware of that as you were writing that? Did you kind of see that it was sort of a hybrid? Because I just read it again recently, and I was really quite. It's so well written that it really does kind of chronicle that sort of in between period where we were still doing miniatures, but then we were doing digital technology. It was a really nice hybrid of different techniques.
Well, yeah, they, the Titanic miniature, they had I guess everybody, it's fairly common, I think most people who know anything about movies know that in addition to, they went down to Mexico and built a tank and built an almost full-size replica of the Titanic and sunk it, with these hydraulic rigs. But in addition to that, they built this miniature, very detailed miniature, which, I don't know, I would guess was maybe 30 feet long. I don't know. And they shot most of the scenes of the ship were using this miniature. And yet, then they would take it and they would digitally composite in water. And there's that one scene, I guess it's the one where Leonardo and his friend are up on the front of the ship and they did this big pan around the whole ship. And you see people walking around on it. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, that's the first time I recall seeing human characters on miniatures. Mm-hmm. Usually, when you had a ship at sea, the camera was always back far enough so that you didn't realize there was nobody on it.
Right.
And so this one...
Or sometimes you did realize that nobody was on it.
Yeah. But, here, and they used, variation of motion capture, I guess it was, primitive motion capture.
They motion captured Don.
Yeah,
Don's on the Titanic.
I went down with the Titanic, folks. Yeah. I'm sorry. And they had all these people walking around on the ship and doing all this kind of stuff, and that was pretty revolutionary for the time.
Yeah.
So that's you could tell that it was a hybrid in that sense. They were kind of getting into the technology, the digital technology, but they weren't confident enough to say, okay, we're going to commit to doing the whole Titanic ship as CG at that time.
I actually missed that aspect of it because it was sort of a time where you could use the best technique for the job and then everything didn't look the same. You know, there was a certain kind of, if you mixed a bag of tools, then it kind of doesn't allow you to meaning there's a certain vocabulary in visual effects movies today that you kind of know what's going on, and that takes you out of the film a little bit.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things actually Van Ling, I remember, said in our State of the Art thing, because Van was one of the 50, was that with digital you can make everything perfect, but just because you can, should you? Is a perfect shot really quite as good? Does it hit you in a visceral way as something where there's something a little off, there's a little mistake? Actually, it's one of the genius things about Cameron, because he's known that from the beginning, even when he was doing more traditional effects. The camera doesn't quite follow the guide it's like it's supposed to, and he was always really good about that. The mistakes that happen when you're actually filming something that make it more real for a human being. And one of the examples Don and I have talked about, we used to both be, huge James Bond fans. And what's like the most fun thing about a James Bond movie, right? It's the first sequence that you always knew was going to be this big stunt sequence, and he's, you got him skiing down Mount Everest or something, And it's like once they got to where they started using digital stuff, well, you don't have really necessarily stunt guys up there anymore. And is it as fun as a viewer to see where nobody was really ever in danger, or they didn't have to do a bunch of rigs? I don't know. This may be a generational thing, honestly. It may be that, for people my age and Don's age, it's never going to be as good, the same way, no one's going to be as good as the Beatles or something, So that might just be an age thing. I don't know. How do you feel about
Well,
it?
Michael Jackson's pretty good too.
Yeah. Oh, you're old. Michael Jackson.
Well, Beatles and Michael Jackson.
I mean, I've often used the example of, if Lawrence of Arabia were being made today, they'd shot it on a green screen stage somewhere, and they'd have a miniature train that they blew up, and they'd have a bunch of motion captured, Arabs on camels running across CG sand dunes, and maybe it would have looked exactly the same. But I think there's I don't know whether you could, even if it was there was indistinguishable one after the other between real photography, and there's just something about knowing that they actually went out and shot it that's just really kind of, for me anyway, is very appealing. So it's just, I don't really think that, back when we did a 25th anniversary, I think it was 20th, it might have been 20th, for ILM.
Yeah.
And we interviewed Dennis Murin for that, because he was kind of like the god at ILM at the time, and still is, I guess. And I remember he kind of wrapped it up by saying, if he wasn't sure that if he were growing up in the business, or growing up at that time, whether he would even have gone into visual effects, because he said he just didn't think special effects were that special anymore. And the point he was making is that you had a movie like Star Wars, which I think had, 300 visual effects shots in it, something like that. And now, and this was long ago, but now you've got movies that have, 2,000, 3,000 visual effects shots. And I'm not sure that movies are any better for that, and in my opinion, they're a lot worse. I think they aren't special anymore. It's just, it's
Oh, that's cruel, Van. That is cruel. And that reminds me of something.
They're not
Jar
special.
Jar is not special?
They're not special in the sense that, oh my God, that's amazing. You wait for the whole movie to see, Sinbad fighting the skeleton swordsman. That is special because, and when it's the whole movie is that, it's just kind of numbing after a while.
So are there some more contemporary special effects films that you do like?
Sure.
What are they?
Go ahead.
I loved, and I'm not just saying this to suck up to you either, because it's part of it, but I loved The Curious Case of Benjamin Button. I loved the movie. I loved everything. And first of all, yeah, thank you. I had kind of heard what they were doing. I got to see the movie quite early. David Fincher let us come to his office there with the tower on it, and we just sat, Donna and I just sat in a screening room. So it was in the back of my mind what they'd done, but I really, and when this guy showed up like that, I kind of got tears in my eyes, and I was just blown away. I thought it was so beautiful. And yeah, you could, it's dated a little bit now, but it actually holds up really well. I just watched it not too long ago again. I think I've watched that movie 20 times. But Matt World also did some beautiful shots in there that were just lovely. It's partly Fincher, it's partly you guys, it's just partly the kind of director he is. But I thought that was a stunning example. And, no miniatures in there that I can think of, so it was all a digital thing, but it was just so beautifully done.
Yeah, I think, a lot of it, the sort of summer tentpole has a certain vocabulary to it that seems very similar, very familiar. And every once in a while, there's also an opportunity to make a film using digital technology that can be entertaining and different, and I think, that's a case of that. And I remember seeing dailies, usually waiting for David to talk about my stuff, looking at the makeup and digital makeup and the stuff that DD was doing, and they were talking about very esoteric things. It took me a while to understand what they were talking about. I mean, it was really drilling down on very esoteric aspects of it. And I think it's so far ahead, in some cases it's still far ahead of anything's being done today, that every once in a while you get the right director with the right creative people together to really push things forward, and that's an example. But we never really found an audience for the film, which was really too bad because it was not considered successful, which was sad because it is so successful on so many things as far as storytelling and technology.
Yeah, my daughter and I say that you can divide the world into people who get the Curious Case of Benjamin Button and people who don't. And we just have nothing to do with people who don't know. That's not true.
That's great.
It is a watershed movie.
I think everybody here loves it too.
And also, I personally think, I really like a lot of what Christopher Nolan does. For one thing, he roots his films. For one thing, they're very story-oriented, and he's actually telling a story, which... anyway. And he roots as much as he possibly can in real photography and uses effects only when he absolutely has to. He'd rather take a jet airplane and have people rappelling off helicopters onto it flying over the Mojave Desert or wherever it was than do it, relatively simply and cheaply in CG. And I think, Jody and I disagree on this, but I think I really liked Inception a lot. I just thought conceptually it was an awesome movie and very nicely executed. And I think, he has a very strong story sense, and ultimately that's what you go to the movies for. You don't kind of go to see how many cities you can blow up.
And of course, the ending was so obvious.
Oh yeah, I had that.
There's no problem with that.
I had that nailed from the first reel. Yeah,
clearly, okay, we won't give it away, but we know what it is.
Yeah, Christopher Nolan is kind of like, he would make Lawrence of Arabia the way they made it, the way David Lean made it, right? Yeah. I mean, he has a Cecil B. DeMille streak in him a mile wide. He doesn't seem to mind getting out there with 2,000 extras, and nobody does that anymore.
Yeah, and of course, Lawrence of Arabia was real, but how did they get that train to slide on the sand? There's something going on there.
That was real.
Trains don't slide on sand.
Have you ever seen one?
Just intuitively, I know that.
But it was a real. It was real train. It was a real sand.
Some special effects going on.
They might have had a rig there.
Janine and I, Janine Peroy and I wrote a book on all the art and making of the Dark Knight trilogy. So we covered all three of those Christopher Nolan Batman books. Boy, I'll tell you, by the time that was over, we just both had such respect for him. He's a really special filmmaker, I think.
Yeah, I mean, if you go back there, that's where he was using real guys rappelling onto a jet.
Yeah, there's
real,
the book.
real plane,
Thank
you know.
A little plug for the book, but it's a cool book. I have to say, it really is.
It's a great book.
mean,
If you don't all have that book, you really need to get it. Seriously, I mean, it's a great book.
And also,
Jody has written probably 2 of the defining books on the subject of visual effects. That's one of them, and the other one is the book that she did on this gentleman's father, Stan Winston, the late great. And Jody did a phenomenal job on that book as well. So.
my favorite project ever.
Good cover, too.
I only had one person I had to please, and that was Stan Winston. I didn't have studio people and all of that. And he called me every day to the point that my sister, who was working in the office at the time, would say, "Your friend Stan Winston's on the phone." And it's true. He was my friend. I loved him. And he was so supportive and so great. I mean, just from that experience, I know why Stan just inspired as many careers as he did, because he did something that some people almost never do, is he hired me to do it, he trusted me to do it, and he left me alone to do it. You know, he trusted me. He didn't second guess me. It was just and then once you know you had his trust, you were going to work the hardest you possibly could to make sure you didn't disappoint him. It was real genius. I've seen a lot of people work very hard not to disappoint him, and he is deeply missed.
Yes.
You know, while we're on the subject of books and non-Cinefex things, Jody is the queen of making up books.
I hate it when you call me that.
I think the only person who's probably done more of them than Jody is Mark Cadavaz, who
I've done more than he has.
Oh, have you really? Okay.
I'm sorry.
Well,
who's counting? But I have.
A lot of his are these.
Apparently somebody.
A lot of his. He did a lot of the art books, you know, things like that.
Yeah.
But I did the 3 of them back a long time ago. And the first one was Ghostbusters. Was making Ghostbusters, which Jody helped me on, even though she didn't get credit. And then we wrote T2 and Jurassic Park together. And it was the same thing on those 2 projects. What was great about that is we had one person we had to satisfy on both of those, Steven Spielberg and Jim Cameron. And I can remember finishing chapters of the T2 book, and we were kind of writing as we went. We spent a lot of time on the set on that movie. And we'd write a chapter, and I'd take it out to him. He'd be shooting in the steel mill out in Fontana, and it'd be 2 o'clock in the morning. And it was between setups, and he'd say, "Jim, we got another chapter here." And he'd sit down, and he'd read through the whole thing and say, "Yeah, it's good." And so, you know, that was just a marvelous way to do it. And then fortunately, I was smart enough to say, "Okay, that's enough. I'm not going to do any more of these." And then Jody kind of started doing a whole bunch of them on her own. And it just kind of got progressively worse as far as dealing with the levels of people who felt they, you know, had the obligation to improve.
Again, it's just like the visual effects industry.
Yeah, it is. It is very much like it. And here's the reason why. If you're the guy at the top, if you're Stan Winston or you're Steven Spielberg or you're Jim Cameron, you have no fear. If you say it's fine, then that means it's fine. Oh gosh, you had to bring up Flintstones. I noticed before you skipped over that one. I was like, good, they skipped over Flintstones. But anyway, actually that was fun to do, but a little embarrassing. But anyway, you know, the people at the top have no fear. So they say it's good, they like it, you know. But everyone below that, once you start getting into layers of you know, studio people, everyone's afraid of losing their job. This is the one thing you need to know about the film industry. If you don't already, probably most of you here do, more than I do. It's just consumed with fear. Fear rules the day, and everyone's afraid of being fired. And so they're afraid to say, yeah, this is good, because what if, you know, they're all just kind of covering their butts all the time. So, boy, that was the best. That was the best, when all we had to do was please the person at the top. Because everybody else, if Steven Spielberg is happy, no one else has anything to say, believe me, you know? So that's what was great about that. It's worse when you have to kind of work your way up to that person and get through a million people. Yes?
Are we allowed to say something?
No, you're not. Yes, we're go ahead.
Before we get too far past Daddy.
Excuse me, this is Matt Winston, for those of you who don't know him.
I just want to say, a lot of amazing creations came out of Stan Winston's studio, but in the last years of his life, when he was asked what was the proudest creation that came out of that shop, he would always say the Winston effect, because within those pages you could see an entire history of an army of people, and bringing it all together between those covers really had impact. And the fact that he chose Jody to literally write the book on his career tells you in what high regard he.
Stand by, a microphone is coming.
It was a high honor.
Well, can you kind of hear me?
Yeah, he's an actor.
I have a diaphragm. I'm an actor.
Yeah, he's an actor.
Well,
Yeah.
we're also videotaping this, so.
Oh, okay. Well, I was just saying that,
There you
the
go.
fact that the Winston effect was my father's proudest achievement in many ways in the last years of his life, that it happened, and that the book was written, and that it told the story in such a clear, and by the way, there's nothing wrong with the clear story you guys tell. All the flash is what makes it, getting rid of that is what makes it great, because you tell the story. And anyway, just on behalf of the Winston family, that whole thank you reel you had, if Dad was alive, he would thank you for legitimizing the technicians, and giving them a platform and giving them the proper respect that they deserve. And my earliest memories going to Stan Winston's studio, Cinefex was in the front office and Fangoria was in the bathroom. And we love Fangoria, but in terms of representing this industry, there was stacks of Cinefex, because you guys represented this industry how my father felt this industry should be represented, with class, and you guys are the greatest. So.
Well, thank you. And one more comment about Stan. That one of the lovely things about Stan is he surrounded himself with brilliant artists and technicians. And when it came time to do his story in the book, and also his story in the magazine, various things we've covered, he was very generous in making sure that he pushed the people to us that he felt deserved the credit, and it wasn't just all me.
Yeah.
That's great. So, your visual effects, we've been sort of saying, there was a clip where someone from China was talking about wanting to have Cinefex in China. So you've made some efforts to make the magazine global, or is that in the future? Are you interested in that, or?
Well, I'll get back to China in a second, but since we've had a number of foreign language editions of Cinefex that were strictly licensed. I mean, we would license a foreign publisher to publish it, and we would send them the material. They would translate it. We would send them the images, and they would produce their own version of the magazine. Sometimes just very literal, and other times they would add some local, articles and things.
You should say what countries don't.
Yeah. So the
Japan
first one was Japan, which was actually, I think our first Japanese issue was like 1983. So it was not too long after the magazine started, which was 1980, and. That we're on our third publisher over there now. The current one's been doing it for about 8 years, but almost for the full run of Cinefex, we've had a Japanese edition of the magazine. There's probably been a few gaps in there, but they have recognized, the importance of getting that kind of information out to their people.
No, it's a different aspect ratio there.
Yeah, that's.
It's not the classic.
That's correct.
Cinefex.
Yeah. Well, we didn't actually. The first Japanese publisher published it in our aspect ratio. The recent ones went for the more traditional ones. I just didn't want to go to having to have people like you put it
in the wrong place.
Put it in the wrong place. Yeah. But we don't. We don't micromanage them. We pretty much let them do what they want to do. So anyway, we had the Japanese thing back in the back in the 80s sometime. We had 2 different French publishers, each published it for a year. So we had like 8 French issues. We had 3 issues of an Italian version. We had a Russian edition for about 6 years that just went away about a year ago.
And Don, I just want to clarify, in every case, this wasn't you trying to go out and make it. People came to you, right?
Oh, yeah.
And said, we want to do this.
Yeah, people.
So it's not like we were trying to go multi,
Yeah, I'd like to take some credit for being that, but no, that was, they did basically came to us. And just recently, I just had a meeting a couple of weeks ago. We're in serious discussion with a publisher in South Korea that wants to do a Chinese and Korean edition of the magazine, which will probably, if all proceeds in the direction it's heading now, will probably be out in the end of this year. So there's kind of an ongoing interest to kind of get the word out, and it's kind of it makes more sense now, frankly, than it did when the French were trying to do it, and the Italians even, because the industry itself is much more of a global industry than it used to be. So I think the publisher that I spoke to from Korea, they're just saying that there's a demand for that. The industry is kind of getting a foothold over there, and there's kind of a demand for the technology and the information. We've always had kind of a split demographic. We've had people in the business, and then we've had just fans. And so previously, I think the foreign language editions were more geared toward the fans, but now I think they're realizing that it's the industry is becoming global, and there's more of a need for it as a technical journal for the people who are actually doing the work.
I think you really have fans that then become people that want to do the work too, and it's a transition.
Well, yeah, I think that's true. I mean, Jody comments on it a lot. She goes around. I don't really write for the magazine anymore, but Jody still does, and she's always running into people and say, "Oh yeah, I read you when I was 8."
Yeah, I love that. I've been reading the magazine since I was 8 years old. Thanks.
Yeah.
No, it is. Actually, that makes me feel really good.
So what do we have to look forward to? Do you have your, we were talking about Nolan. I assume that you'll be covering his efforts. We know there's a big film out there that he's working on.
Yes, and in typical Christopher Nolan fashion, we know nothing at all about it. He's very secretive, but also very supportive of us. Yeah, he's been great to work with, and even though they hold things pretty close to the vest there, including the imagery. They always when they get around to wanting to talk about it, they are very generous with us as far as both access to people and access to imagery. So we like people who like us.
And that would be the same with Jim Cameron as well, I assume.
Oh yeah, definitely. One of my favorite Jim Cameron stories kind of is when we had our coverage of Titanic. It was actually came out about 2 or 3 weeks before the movie released. It was our December issue, and it came out early in the month. And I remember running into, I think you might have been with me, we had a screening at Paramount, and the vice president of publicity at Paramount at the time came up to me, and he had seen the magazine and seen the movie, and he says, "You did a really nice job in the magazine." He says, "You realize if you had come to me, you wouldn't have had any of that stuff." Because basically Cameron just, he wanted us to cover it. He supported it all the way. He made sure that we got access to the people and the movie and the stills, and basically cut the studio out of the picture. And so we were able to do what I think is really a superb bit of coverage. Jody and I kind of split that issue. I wrote 2 of the articles, and she wrote one of them. And I'm very proud of that particular issue. There was a lot of really interesting stuff on that one.
These relationships that you have obviously lasted over time and continue to be more important to you.
We've talked about the fact that if we were trying to start the magazine, or Don was trying to start the magazine now, you couldn't do it in this climate. Luckily, he started back literally, when Don started Cinefex, there was Apogee, there was EEG, and there was a newly formed ILM, and that's pretty much it. There were like 3 you know, and then there were like Gene Warren's kind of physical models
too.
thing. And there were a few things like that. But I mean, it was such a small world. And so you called up Dennis Muren, and it was very intimate. And so you formed relationships, and it wasn't corporate in the way that it is now. And I mean, the whole movie business, I'm not just talking about visual effects. So you could get to the top people, and you could talk to them, and you could, you know, say, yeah, that'd be fine. I mean, what was the film you just talked about the other day? That you literally went through the movie frame by frame to pick out the images you wanted?
Yeah, now it's the whole photo process is grueling, and I did that for a long time on my own. That was kind of my contribution to the magazine for a long time. And now I've pawned that off on my creative director over there, who's
meaning that you would choose the photos for the layout of the imagery.
Right. Yeah. Getting the imagery, which has become an increasingly arduous process. But anyway, another story I like to tell is on the very first issue of the magazine. And again, the problem with it is because there's so many levels of approval. So, first issue of the magazine, Doug Trumbull. I spent a lot of time over there at Doug's place at Entertainment Effects Group. Actually, it might have been Future General. No, I guess it was Entertainment Effects Group by then. And he, when it got time to get imagery to illustrate the article, he takes me into the editing room, and he's got an old reel hand editor, and he's got his 65 millimeter show reel. 65 millimeters about that thick, and the reel itself was like this. It's like it was every effect shot in the movie. And he sits me down there with a splicer, and he says, "Go to it." And I spent like the afternoon kind of going through practically frame by frame, and I just literally pulled.
This is Star Trek, right?
Oh, I'm sorry, yeah, Star Trek: The Motion Picture. And so I'd go in and pull 5-frame clips, and I must have had 100 of them by the time I finished. And so I got my clips, and I put them in an envelope and went home, and we published them. And
that doesn't happen anymore.
Now we can't even. The visual effects companies are not allowed to give us anything. We have to go through the studios to get the imagery we want. But it's even more complicated than that, because the studios are not particularly all that interested in getting matte paintings, for example, shots including matte paintings, because all they're really interested in is the 20 key shots from the movie that have the actors in them. And so what we now do...
Slipped you a few things on Benjamin Button, I remember.
Yeah, well, once in a while we slip them.
And Hugo. We got a few things in Hugo, too.
Yeah. But... and then so now we have to, where was I going with that? Anyway,
the marketing departments have to approve everything.
Yeah, everything has to be approved, and what I was starting to say. What we now do, and Greg is doing now, is when we're covering a film, and there's often as many as a dozen visual effects companies. We go out to the effects company and say, "Hey guys, we're covering your movie. Please put together some great shots. Send it to the studio publicity department, still department. Please send them to them and tell them they're for Cinefex and ask them to run it through the approval process." So we're basically doing the studio's work for them. And then after we go through that whole process, then it turns out the studio approves it and everybody else gets it, and often they publish it before we do. So it's kind of a frustrating process. But
I remember some of that, because it would be like we would have to do the groundwork. On Alice in Wonderland, we had to get permission from from Tim that was okay, and he wasn't necessarily available. So we're like, okay, we're going to publish it this day. If we can get him to say yes by then, it's going to go in. If not, it's not going to go in. It must be just traumatic to lay out the
every gray hair on Don's head.
Yeah,
is pretty much waiting, getting down to the wire. I mean, we've literally had, John Van Vliet is effects artist and cartoonist, said that the ongoing nightmare for visual effects guy is that, and he wrote a cartoon that did this, it's like that the movie's going to have this sudden, blank thing, and it'll say, shot frame empty because Ernie didn't finish his visual effects shot, you know? And honestly, we've had times where we thought, are we going to have empty blank pages in the magazine because the studio wouldn't approve or we couldn't get the imagery? It's been cliffhangers sometimes.
We had one just a couple of issues ago that we were tempted just to run the article with a bunch of blank holes in it and saying the director would not approve any of the images that we had picked for that.
Don was going to write, publish a letter to this director who shall remain nameless.
Do an open
He was. He was so mad. He was going to
written.
publish. You had it written. I'd love to see it. And
Van, is it on the? No?
Here's the thing. It could be. I wouldn't be surprised. But Don's like getting towards the end of this for him. But he doesn't care. What does he care if they're all mad at him at this point? I mean, I still care, and Greg cares. Greg has to go get photos from him. But, Don's getting increasingly
Cranky.
cranky.
I understand.